June 23, 1945. The USS General W.P. Richardson glides under the Golden Gate Bridge, carrying its most unusual cargo yet. On deck, 147 German women stand in the California sunlight. They're wearing the same gray uniforms they wore in Nazi Germany, the same clothes they wore when the Wehrmacht surrendered just 6 weeks ago. But everything else has changed. These aren't nurses. They aren't civilians caught in the crossfire. They're Nachrichtenhelferinnen, communications auxiliaries of the German military. Trained operators, telegraph specialists, women who wore the Wehrmacht uniform and served Hitler's war machine until the very end. Now they're prisoners of war, enemy combatants on American soil, and they're about to experience something that will shatter every belief they've held for 12 years, because what's waiting for them in California isn't what they expect. No barbed wire death camps, no starvation, no systematic cruelty. Instead, they'll find something far more dangerous to Nazi ideology. They'll find abundance, choice, dignity, and a freedom so unexpected, so incomprehensible, that it will force them to question everything they've been told about America, about democracy, and about their own role in one of history's darkest chapters. This is the story of the German women, POWs who came to America expecting the worst, and found something that would change them forever. To understand what these women expected, you have to understand what they'd been told their entire adult lives. Since 1933, German propaganda had painted a specific picture of America, a nation in decline, weak, decadent, run by Jews and criminals, a place where unemployment and poverty reigned, where workers were exploited without mercy, where racial violence and lynchings were everyday occurrences, and most importantly, a nation that would treat its prisoners with the same brutality Germany showed to its enemies. These 147 women had grown up in that system. The youngest was just 19, the oldest 38. They'd joined the Nachrichtenhelferinnen between 1940 and 1944, serving in German-occupied territories across Europe. They'd operated switchboards in Poland, coded messages in France, transmitted orders in Belgium and the Netherlands. They weren't SS guards. They hadn't run concentration camps, but they'd worn the uniform. They'd served the regime, and under the Geneva Convention's definition, they were legitimate prisoners of war. When Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945, these women found themselves in a terrifying limbo. The Soviet army was sweeping across Eastern Europe, and stories of mass rapes and executions preceded them. The British and Americans were rounding up German military personnel by the hundreds of thousands. What would happen to women in Wehrmacht uniforms? The answer came swiftly. British forces captured the bulk of these female auxiliaries in northern Germany. Over 500 German women were designated as POWs. But the British didn't have facilities for female prisoners. They didn't have protocols. They didn't even have female guards. So they made a deal with the Americans. On May 28, 1945, 147 German women POWs were loaded onto trucks in Neumünster, Germany. They were driven to Cuxhaven, put on trains to the port, loaded onto a transport ship. Each woman was allowed one small bag of personal belongings. Nothing more. The voyage across the Atlantic took 3 weeks. 3 weeks of uncertainty, 3 weeks of rumor and fear spreading through the cramped quarters below deck. What they didn't know was that in Washington, D.C., a bureaucratic scramble was underway. The War Department had never dealt with female enemy POWs before. Never. There was no Camp Clausewitz for women, no Stalag, Ohio. The entire POW system, over 400 camps holding nearly 400,000 German and Italian prisoners, had been designed exclusively for men. Where do you put 147 enemy women? Colonel Archer Lurch, the Provost Marshal General's representative for POW operations, faced an unprecedented problem. These women couldn't be mixed with male prisoners. That violated Geneva Convention protocols. They couldn't be sent to civilian internment camps. They were uniformed military personnel. They couldn't just be released. The war with Japan was still raging, and politically, releasing German prisoners while American boys died in the Pacific was unthinkable. The solution came from an unlikely source. Florence, Arizona, a small desert town about 60 miles south of Phoenix. Population, roughly 2,500. The town had a federal prison, built in 1908, which had been modified during the war to hold enemy, aliens, civilians from Axis nations who were deemed security risks. But next to that prison sat something else, a small auxiliary camp, originally built to handle overflow from the main facility, mostly empty now, hot as hell, surrounded by desert, and most importantly, secure, isolated, and available. On June 15, 1945, the decision was made. The German women would go to Florence. Military police units scrambled to prepare the facility. Barracks needed to be cleaned, fencing reinforced, a medical facility established. Female staff had to be recruited, guards, administrators, medical personnel, all in less than 2 weeks. Because ready or not, those 147 women were already crossing the Atlantic. They had no idea what awaited them. Neither did their American captors. When the USS General W.P. Richardson docked in San Francisco on June 23rd, the women disembarked expecting the worst. Margaret Wieland, a 24-year-old telegraph operator from Dresden, later described the moment. "We thought we would be shot on arrival or at the very least beaten and starved. That's what we'd been told would happen. That's what German propaganda said Americans did to prisoners. Instead, they were processed through immigration, given medical examinations, fed hot meals, treated, in Wieland's words, like human beings, not animals. The shock was immediate, but the real transformation hadn't even begun." On June 25th, the women were loaded onto a special train, not cattle cars, but actual passenger cars, and transported south, through California's Central Valley, across the border into Arizona, through Phoenix, and finally to Florence. They arrived at night. The desert temperature still hovered near 90 degrees. Searchlights illuminated the camp as the train pulled to a stop. What they saw was not the death camp they'd imagined. The Florence POW camp for women consisted of 6 wooden barracks, each designed to hold 25 people. There was a mess hall, a recreation building, a medical clinic, an administrative building. The entire facility covered about 4 acres and was surrounded by a 12-foot chain-link fence, topped with barbed wire. It looked, in the words of one prisoner, like a work camp we might build for foreign laborers, not like a place of punishment. The commandant was Colonel Daniel Harmon, a career Army officer who'd overseen male POW camps in Texas and Oklahoma. He'd been transferred to Florence specifically for this assignment. He'd been given clear instructions from Washington: follow Geneva Convention protocols to the letter. Treat these prisoners correctly. Give the Red Cross nothing to complain about. But Harmon went further than mere compliance. Within the first week, he established a routine that would have been unthinkable in Germany's POW camps. The women were divided into work details: kitchen duty, laundry, camp maintenance, clerical work. But here's what shocked them. They were paid. Under Geneva Convention rules, POWs who worked had to receive compensation. The rate was 80 cents per day in scrip, camp currency that could be spent at the camp canteen. 80 cents doesn't sound like much. But to women who expected slavery or death, it was revolutionary. Ingrid Schumann, a 21-year-old from Hamburg, described going to the canteen for the first time. There were chocolates. Real chocolate, Coca-Cola, cigarettes, soap, toothpaste, things we hadn't seen in Germany for years, and we could just buy them. With money we'd earned. Nobody yelled at us. Nobody called us names. The woman at the counter, an American woman, smiled and said thank you when I paid. That small transaction, that simple exchange of dignity and courtesy, began to crack the foundation of everything they believed. But the real shock came when they saw how much food they were getting. The U.S. Army had strict regulations about POW rations. German prisoners were to receive the same quality and quantity of food as American soldiers. Not less, not scraps, the same. For women who'd lived under German rationing since 1939, who'd watched rations shrink year after year, who'd seen civilians starving in occupied territories, this was incomprehensible. Breakfast included eggs, bread, butter, coffee, and fruit. Real coffee, not the ersatz chicory substitute they'd drunk in Germany. Lunch and dinner featured meat, potatoes, vegetables, sometimes dessert. The portions were large. Nobody went hungry. Hildegard Meyer, a 28-year-old from Berlin, recalled, "I gained 15 pounds in the first 2 months. We all did. We couldn't believe it. America was supposed to be starving. They were supposed to be rationing everything. But they fed us, their enemies, better than our own government fed German citizens." The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. Colonel Harmon implemented other policies that shocked his prisoners. The women were allowed to write letters home, heavily censored but still contact with family. They were allowed to receive care packages from the Red Cross. They could attend religious services. A Lutheran chaplain was brought in weekly from Phoenix. And perhaps most remarkably, they were allowed education. The camp established a small library with books in German and English. Women who wanted to learn English could attend classes taught by bilingual guards. There were music nights where prisoners could sing. Not Nazi songs, obviously, but folk songs. Traditional music. But here's where things got really interesting. In August 1945, something happened that would change everything for these women. Something that would force them to confront the truth about the regime they'd served. The war with Japan ended on August 15, 1945. VJ Day. The war was finally, completely over, and Colonel Harmon made a decision. He decided his prisoners needed to see something. In November 1945, documentary footage from the liberation of the concentration camps was being shown across America. The horrific images from Bergen-Belsen, Dachau, Buchenwald, the piles of emaciated bodies, the gas chambers, the crematoria. The U.S. Army had a policy called re-education for German POWs. The goal was to denazify them, to confront them with the truth about the Holocaust, about the war crimes committed in their name. Harmon arranged for the women of Florence to watch these documentaries. The screenings were not mandatory. Prisoners could refuse. But Harmon made it clear, this is what happened in your name. This is what your government did while you transmitted their messages and connected their phone calls. Most of the women watched. The reaction was complicated. Some claimed it was Allied propaganda, lies designed to make Germans feel guilty. These women clung to their Nazi ideology, refusing to believe the evidence before their eyes. But many others broke down, sobbed, couldn't finish watching. Margaret Wieland described it. "I saw people I recognized, children I could have gone to school with, women who looked like my mother. And I realized we'd been told these people were enemies of Germany, but they were just people who'd been murdered systematically, industrially, and I'd served the people who did this. This wasn't forced confession. This was genuine horror, genuine confrontation with reality. And here's what made it even more powerful. These women were sitting in an American prison camp, well-fed, treated with dignity, safe, while they watched footage of what German camps had done to their prisoners. The contrast was stark, undeniable. The Florence experiment became a model for POW re-education. Army officials visited regularly to observe. Reports were filed, psychological assessments conducted. But the most powerful transformation wasn't happening in official reports. It was happening in conversations between prisoners. In letters home to Germany, in slow, painful realizations, Ingrid Schumann later wrote, "I started to understand that everything they told us about America was a lie. If they lied about this and about how Americans would treat us, what else did they lie about? About the Jews? About the war? About everything?" By early 1946, the mood in the camp had shifted dramatically. Most of the women no longer identified as Nazis. Some actively rejected their past. Others simply fell silent, processing trauma and guilt. The American guards noticed the change. Captain Elizabeth Morrison, who served as the camp's chief female officer, reported, "When they first arrived, these women sang German military songs. They gave the Hitler salute when they thought we weren't watching." By Christmas 1945, that had stopped. By spring 1946, many were asking to stay in America rather than return to Germany. That last part is crucial. Let it sink in. German prisoners of war, women who'd served Hitler's military, asking to stay in the country they'd been told was their mortal enemy. The question of repatriation became urgent in mid-1946. Europe was in chaos. Germany was divided into 4 occupation zones. Millions of displaced persons were trying to find their way home. The infrastructure was destroyed. Food was scarce. The economy had collapsed, and the Americans needed to empty their POW camps. By June 1946, most German male POWs had already been repatriated. The camps were closing down. The machinery of war was being dismantled. But what about the women of Florence? The army faced a dilemma. These women had family in various parts of Germany, some in the Soviet zone, some in the British zone, some in the American zone. Some had no family left at all and their homes destroyed, their relatives killed or missing, and as Captain Morrison noted in her reports, many didn't want to go back. At least 30 women formally requested to remain in the United States. They offered to renounce their German citizenship, to work as laborers, housekeepers, anything. They'd seen American abundance. They'd experienced American freedom. They'd learned English. They'd been treated with more dignity as enemy prisoners than they'd ever known as German citizens. The answer from Washington was firm. No American immigration law in 1946 had strict quotas. German immigration was particularly restricted, and politically, allowing Nazi soldiers, even female auxiliaries, to immigrate was impossible. They had to go home. The repatriation process began in July 1946. The women were processed in groups of 25. Medical examinations, security interviews, assessment of where each woman should be sent based on their place of origin and family connections. The farewell scenes were complicated. Some guards had formed genuine friendships with prisoners. Not Stockholm Syndrome, but real human connections. Captain Morrison wrote in her final report, "These women arrived as enemies. They leave as human beings who've confronted terrible truths and emerged changed. I hope they'll help rebuild a better Germany." On September 12, 1946, the last group of German women POWs left Florence, Arizona. They were transported to Camp Shanks in New York, then loaded onto the transport ship SS Marine Marlin bound for Bremerhaven. The camp at Florence was dismantled. The barracks were torn down. Within a year, you couldn't tell there'd been a POW camp there at all. But for the women who'd lived there, those 15 months would define the rest of their lives. What happened when they got back to Germany? The records are fragmentary. The chaos of post-war Germany meant many people simply disappeared into the reconstruction effort. But some stories survived. Margaret Wieland returned to Dresden, or what was left of it. The city had been destroyed by Allied firebombing. She found work as a translator for American occupation forces, using the English she'd learned in Florence. In 1951, she wrote a letter to Captain Morrison. She'd gotten married, had a child, was building a new life. She ended the letter, "Thank you for showing me that humanity can exist even between enemies. It saved my life in more ways than one." Ingrid Schumann returned to Hamburg and became a teacher. In the 1960s, she began speaking to students about her experiences, including her time in Florence. She was part of the generation that forced Germany to confront its Nazi past. She died in 2003, but her recorded testimony sits in archives at the University of Hamburg. Not all the stories ended positively. Some women returned to find their families destroyed. Some struggled with guilt and trauma. Some never spoke about their experiences at all. But here's what matters. The American experiment in treating enemy prisoners with dignity, even at the height of war, even when those enemies had served the most evil regime in modern history, that experiment worked. These women arrived expecting death camps and found democracy. They arrived expecting cruelty and found courtesy. They arrived believing lies and were confronted with truth. Did it redeem them? No, redemption is too simple a word for the complicated process of confronting complicity and evil. But it changed them. It challenged them. It forced them to reckon with reality in a way that cruelty never could have. The Florence camp for German women POWs operated for exactly 15 months. In the grand scope of World War II history, it's a footnote, a curiosity, a minor detail in a conflict that killed 75 million people. But it represents something profound about American values. Not as propaganda, but as lived reality. The United States didn't treat these women well because they deserved it. They'd served evil. They'd participated in a genocidal regime's war machine. They had blood on their hands, even if they never pulled a trigger. America treated them well because of who America aspired to be, because the Geneva Conventions mattered, even when the enemy had violated them. Because dignity wasn't something you earned through virtue, but something inherent to being human. Because showing strength through mercy was more powerful than showing strength through cruelty. This isn't American exceptionalism. America had its own profound sins during World War II, Japanese internment camps, racial segregation, discrimination against Jewish refugees. The treatment of the Florence women doesn't erase those sins, but it does demonstrate that values matter, that institutions matter, that even in war, even against enemies who'd committed atrocities, it's possible to maintain standards of decency. The contrast with German POW camps, with Soviet gulags, with Japanese prisoner treatment was stark, and that contrast became a weapon more powerful than any bomb. Because when those 147 women returned to Germany, they carried with them a truth that propaganda couldn't suppress. America had treated them better as enemies than Germany had treated them as citizens. That realization spread. In conversations over kitchen tables, in letters to family, in quiet admissions years later, the women of Florence didn't win the war. They didn't change the world, but they changed. And in doing so, they became small human testaments to the power of choosing humanity over hatred, even when, especially when, it would have been easier to choose revenge. Today, the site of the Florence POW camp is empty desert. There's no monument, no historical marker. The barracks rotted away decades ago, but the story remains, documented in army records, in letters, in testimonies, a strange small chapter in a massive war, a moment when America faced its enemy with unexpected generosity and found that kindness could be more devastating to evil than any weapon. 147 women arrived in California expecting the worst of America. They found the best instead, and they would spend the rest of their lives trying to reconcile what they'd been told with what they'd experienced. That dissonance, that unbridgeable gap between Nazi lies and American reality, became their education, their punishment, and ultimately, their redemption. The freedom given to enemies wasn't weakness. It was the most powerful victory of all.